Hello everyone, I'm Joanne Lilly, Director of Content and Marketing at CEDA. Welcome to our live stream today, Unlocking the Potential of Science times Technology for Australia's Economic Future. Before we start, CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we're on Aboriginal land. In my case today here in Melbourne, that's the land of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the East Kulin Nation. CEDA pays respects to elders past, present and emerging, supports their stated aspirations and is committed to recognition and reconciliation. On behalf of CEDA, I'd also like to thank and acknowledge our sponsor, Microsoft, for supporting today's event. And thanks in particular to Lee Hickin, Microsoft's Chief Technology Officer for Australia and New Zealand, who will facilitate today's discussion. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. Today, as at all CEDA events, you'll be able to interact with speakers through our Q&A portal, which is available via the link below the video on your screen. Or you can enter the details by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the passcode Economic Future, which is all one word and all in caps. You can post your own questions and you can upvote questions that have been posted by other people. Now, turning our attention to today's discussion. At CEDA, our purpose is to improve the lives of all Australians by enabling a dynamic economy and a vibrant society. One of the ways we do that is by convening conversations around key questions. And I think you'll all agree that Australia's innovation imperative is key to our future prosperity. Today's conversation is a preview of an important project on which CEDA and Microsoft have partnered this year. We've convened a series of conversations with leaders across the science, technology, industry, academia and government sectors to further understand what we see as an awesome opportunity before us as a nation to better harness our inherent Australian ingenuity for the country's future economic growth. And we'll be further exploring the topic with a range of great speakers at our State of the Nation conference in Canberra on the 8th of September. So keep an eye out for that on our website if you're interested. Are we ingenious as a nation? Sure we are. We all know the Australian success stories from the Hills Hoist to Wi-Fi and cochlear implants and Atlassian. But did you know we're also home to some of the most prestigious and productive universities in the world and responsible for 2.7% of the world's scientific output, despite being home to just 0.34% of its population? A decade ago, only a handful of tech stocks on the ASX were worth more than $1 billion. Today, there are more than 30. Yet as of 2020, the OECD average for gross domestic spending on R&D is 2.6% of GDP. Australia sits at just 1.8%. For those of you thinking it's a government issue, think again. At less than 1% of GDP, business spending on R&D in Australia is significantly lower than the OECD average of 1.67% of GDP. Today, 67% of Australia's exports are natural resources. So should this look the same 10 years from now in an ever more sustainability-focused, technology-enabled world? Do we have what it takes to change it up? How do we change it up? These are all good questions, I'm sure you'll agree, and so I'm delighted to be handing over to an expert group today to help answer them. I'll pass now to Lee Hickin, who will facilitate our discussion today. Lee, over to you.
Thank you, Jo, and I appreciate that introduction. And thanks everybody for joining us today. And I would also like to share my acknowledgement and respect to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the custodians of the land where I live here in the northern beaches of Sydney. So as you heard from Jo, today's session is somewhat of a warm-up act, if you like, to the upcoming CEDA State of the Nation event on the 8th of September. Now, I've been to a number of shows and comedy events and other shows where the warm-up act was actually even better than the main show. So hopefully you're going to really enjoy today, and it's going to give you a real taste for the experience that you're going to get from the full release of the report later on in September. But this conversation today is to explore some of those themes and to get you excited about what is possible here in Australia. We've brought together, as you're going to see, some of Australia's most influential thinkers on this subject. This big topic, how do we as a nation accelerate our growth and our economic strength through our heritage of deep scientific and problem solving? To put simply, the goal of science is to answer questions and increase knowledge. And the goal of technology is to find solutions to practical problems. So together, they are both the question and the answer. And of course, as I've just found out, I should have known, this being National Science Week, what could we have a better time to be talking about this topic? You know, we are a nation of problem solvers, of roll up your sleeves and just kind of get it done people. That's our heritage, that's our nature. Most Australians are very familiar with some of our great contributions to the world, such as Wi-Fi and black boxes, and of course some of the lesser known ones like Google Maps that was invented here in Sydney. We're a leading nation in the world for our academic research and the output we put out there. As you heard Joe just mention, we represent something like 2.7% of the world's total scientific output, which seems like a pretty small number, but in real terms is actually Australia kicking above its weight in terms of its contribution. But I think what's a bigger and better measure of that is not just the amount of it, but that 85% of that content is rated above the world standard. And that really leads to the fact that it's not just we're generating lots of research, we're generating lots of really good, important, and impactful science and research. But the future doesn't wait for anybody, and we can't sort of rest on the laurels of our past successes and keep lauding the value of the great things we have done. We need to keep moving forward, and we need to keep that pace of innovation up. Now, this isn't a race, though, and we're not really trying to win, but what we're trying to do is invest our time and energy into building on top of what we already have, building easy and very clear pathways to the commercial success, and ensuring that our future is built on exciting and innovation, and we have impact globally. So what if, as a nation, we were able to supercharge that alignment of our science and technology smarts to both redevelop existing markets that we have here in Australia today, and of course we're seeing that happen in real time now in the energy markets, but also to create new industries, new markets, new products, new skills, and ultimately new jobs? What if we were able to think about new ways as a nation to take risks, to reward failure, to celebrate learnings and create environments where our scientists and our researchers become our innovators and our entrepreneurs, and they have the space to land, expand, and flourish right here in Australia? Now, with the new government, we have a new report and a new statement to this plan to reach 1.2 million new tech jobs by 2030. And it's great to see that ambition. But that's to meet the demand of the opportunity we can see in front of us today. What if we were to introduce 10, 20, 100 new Aussie innovation companies in the ecosystem over the next 3 to 5 years? Imagine the growth on that. Imagine the economic impact, the job creation, the global impact, and the world of opportunities that open up to young Australians everywhere. So the report, which gets released next month, talks about 4 pillars of opportunity of harnessing this science and technology future. Now, I'm not going to give you all the details, you've got to wait for the report for that. But one of the themes of that report that speaks to me personally is this theme of captaincy, this idea that we have accountability for driving our national innovation. No one's going to do it for us. We have to do it ourselves. It suggests that the future's not already decided, that we haven't missed the boat. It suggests that there's an opportunity for us to take that position of captaincy on our future and lead both in terms of ambition, investment, and accountability. And if we take that control now and we show that way forward, we can build something incredible for ourselves, for our children, and ultimately for our children's children. And so with that lofty ambition in place, today we bring together 3 captains from science and industry and technology to discuss these strengths, explore how small and large step changes in our approach could lead to this new economic future for our country. And so with that, I'm going to turn to our first panelist and introduce Misha Shubert. So Misha is the CEO of Science and Technology Australia. Misha, you have a front row seat to observing and driving the change to what we want to see here in Australia. So why don't you tell us a bit about your role, what you perform, and the work you perform at Science and Technology Australia. And in terms of a specific question for you, I've been reading a bit on your website and looking at some of the research you've been doing. I love the fact that you're amplifying this level of trust that we have in a nation in science. And it's great to see that. So I want to ask you, what do you think are the levers that we can pull as a nation to commercialize what I think I heard you refer to before as frontier science? Over to you, Misha.
Thank you so much, Lee, and Yuma from Ngunnawal Ngambri country here in the nation's capital, also honouring that deep, strong tradition of deep skilled scientific knowledge and knowledge making through tens of thousands of years of our country's history. It's such a source of inspiration to us all as Australians. You're absolutely quite right, Lee. We are on the cusp of a golden opportunity for our country, and I want to pay tribute to CEDA and to Microsoft for convening this discussion today. And what an excitement for me to be on a panel with Professor Veena Sahajwalla and Mike Molinari, as well as you, Lee, to unpack the opportunities and the challenges ahead. I'm personally really excited by what I see as an enormous opportunity for Australia to level up our performance in taking more of that brilliant frontier science that we've always been so good at. I like to think of Australia as a nation of cheeky upstarts in our innovation culture, which is why we're so good at frontier science breakthroughs. I think that spirit infuses the very frontier breakthroughs that so many Australian scientists, technologists, engineers and mathematicians have made throughout our history. But perhaps where we haven't always been so strong is in taking more of those frontier breakthroughs and pushing them down that pathway or through the well-known valley of death in translation and commercialisation. So what do we mean by that? Well, essentially, you can have a brilliant lab bench breakthrough in frontier science, a new technology, a new technique, a new innovation that could be a game changer for innovation in our country. That could lead to a new product, a new startup, a new spin out, a new application in an existing strong industry structure. But too often in our country in recent history, where someone's made that breakthrough, both the seed capital to get that innovation further along that pathway, so to develop it to a fully fledged entity, and the skills and drive of our entrepreneurs amongst the science community hasn't always been in a neat linear fashion along that line. And to get those innovations to the point where the private venture capital market gets really interested and where governments, as an investor that perhaps has a more limited appetite for risk than perhaps some parts of the VC market, is the challenge there as well. So what do we need to do to change that picture? Well, essentially, I think there are a couple of big levers that we can think about in policy and in culture shift terms for our country. We need to take that skilled, brilliant scientific workforce and back them in. So we need to help with the seed capital that gets more of those innovations to proof of concept, proof of market, fully engineered prototype in a real world industrial application setting. And we need to give more of our scientists, entrepreneurs and technologists the skills and the knowledge about how you commercialise product and how you actually take things along that pipeline. We have brilliant leaders like Veena Sahajwalla and Professor Mark Hutchinson, who's the President of Science and Technology Australia. We're the national peak body, of course, representing 90,000 scientists and technologists across the country. And Mark and Veena and Professor Sharath Sriram, the nanotechnologist at RMIT, are part of this new constellation of scientists, innovators and technologists who are always leaning into that set of opportunities that can come from commercialising and translating the frontier work that they and their teams are leading. But we need to essentially create more of these brilliant luminous stars. And so what we are very interested in is this idea of building Australia's first generation of what we call bench to boardroom scientists, people who don't just do brilliant frontier science that goes from the lab bench to the bookshelf, published in eminent scientific journals, but people who can take more of that frontier science from the lab bench into the boardrooms and help their innovations along that journey. So that is a key idea that we are really interested in kind of calling out and seeding that idea, looking for partners and others who might be part of that conversation with us. But levelling up the skills and the capabilities of that community is really important there. I want to just finish on a final thought. We've got some parts of the architecture there in the policy levers and the pronouncements of the two major parties of government. So before the last election, the previous government had announced a series of measures to help with research translation and commercialisation, and the new Labor government has also expressed a long-term commitment to wanting to see us turn more science into jobs. And indeed, at the National Science Week launch this week, Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles addressed the audience by talking about the need for us to diversify and make more complex the nature of mix of our economy, but also finished with this thought. He said he thinks the most important piece of microeconomic reform which faces the nation today is infusing our economy with more science and technology. I just want us to sit with that for a moment. This is the Deputy Prime Minister of our country saying that is the most important piece of microeconomic reform before us right now, and I think that's absolutely right. And we need to harness the goodwill of the business community, of government and the whole breadth of the parliament in its multi-party, multi-dimension diversity, and the scientific and technological workforce, which I have the great privilege to speak for each and with every day, to help our country seize this opportunity ahead of us.
Awesome. Thank you, Misha. That's amazing. And You've given me lots of new phrases to keep in my mind. I love that bench to boardroom idea. I think that's really, really strong way to think about it. But and I agree with you, that under that recognition that the government is thinking about just the massive impact that science and technology can have is wonderful to see happening. So I want to turn now, if I can, to Professor Veena Sahajwalla, who you mentioned a couple of times. And Veena, you're one of the many scientists and researchers that we're showcasing and highlighting here, and you do amazing research here in Australia. And of course, you're also a TV star, and you've achieved that life goal that, well, certainly a life goal for me, is you have a dedicated Wikipedia page. And your work in sustainability and waste management is without a doubt world leading. I mean, I was reading about the sort of microfactories concept that you've pioneered in recycling. I'd love to hear a bit more about that. But something I've heard you talk about is this idea of economies of purpose. And perhaps, tell us a bit about the work you do. I'd love to get your thoughts on the bench to boardroom, given that, you've actually kind of taken that journey yourself in many ways. And what I really want to know is, how do we clone you? And if we can't clone you, how do we get more people and more scientists to make that leap into commercial use cases like you have done? So please, over to you, Veena.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lee. And I want to thank you and Joe and CEDA for this tremendous privilege and opportunity to tell you a little bit about this whole journey. I think it's such an important topic. And thanks, Misha, for really so beautifully presenting the case why our country needs to make this happen. And I think, you've hit the nail on the head there and pointing to the fact that we've got amazing, talented people, across the country. And so to pick up on that point around microfactories, if I can for a moment, just kind of share that recent translation. And so we talk about the translation of science and delivery of impact. But I think in all of that infusion of science that I think, Misha, you were talking about to create new jobs and to really sort of start to see the massive effect that's already happening in a short time. I mean, we started with our microfactory journey and getting it out into the commercial realm last year. Yes, we had done the research prior to that, of course, but that whole notion that economies of purpose that we wanted to really showcase was to be able to say, okay, well, now where does it make sense if we were going to start that journey of microfactories? Because the chief sort of feedstock materials in all of this is taking advantage of all of those high quality resources that we just label as waste materials, right? But the realities are that a lot of our resources that we have, we know that there is value in it. It's about harnessing that value. So this is that beautiful sort of case of that interface between science, technology, commerce, and then all of those new jobs that can come out of that. And we actually partnered up with our research partner. And Kandui Technologies is a great example of that. And when we first said, well, let's kind of do it in Cootamundra. And for most people, first of all, it was, where's Cootamundra? And the next question was, for those who knew, okay, why Cootamundra? And I think to me, it sort of captures this point that economies of purpose, the purpose was very simple. We needed to be able to make high quality products, and we needed to do that from predominantly waste resources. But the fact that we could translate what we had done in our own pilot facilities at UNSW and work that through that translation journey very quickly, that rapid translation, I think, is absolutely feasible and doable when we've all got these values, those shared values that are aligned. So for our manufacturing partner, which, by the way, I have to tell you, he was never really a manufacturer, right? This guy was someone who was collecting waste mattresses. But, the penny dropped when he sort of said, so you mean all of that waste textile can actually be diverted into manufacturing and I can create all these highly engineered products? Well, why does that matter? Because suddenly it went from something that was negative value in our economy, because it was only destined for landfill, into something that was significantly positive in its value. And of course, you think about building products where the demand, of course, is there. And if anything, we've learned one thing about supply chains being kind of disrupted when things like COVID fall upon us, right? So to be able to kind of imagine a future where these kinds of microfactories could be seeded, and what we are learning from this one example could then be translated. So it's not just about us saying, here's science and here's technology and here's how we do it. And and telling our industry partner, take it and off you go, but rather really talking about this as a journey. And a journey of translation means all of those people who are part of the supply chain. So if we're going to incorporate all kinds of waste textile, suddenly we've got organizations who want to actually supply what they used to think is waste textiles, now supplying that as a valuable resource. Without getting into all of those details of why scientifically it makes sense, suffices to say this actually did its magic in the sense that for our partner who was actually manufacturing to be able to access in a hub and spokes kind of model, bringing in a whole range of supplies of materials that were undervalued. So not only have we now shown that those supplies of these materials are being valued, but we've actually also shown that new jobs were created off the back of this simple example. So this one example of one microfactory that we have launched. So I guess to me, part of that ability to be able to show that collaboration, partnership, taking that science, but really having that dedicated focus on translation in a collaborative manner means every business can actually take a whole lot of innovation and science and really build new capacity. So, you might think your business is kind of doing this one product. Suddenly now there are opportunities to do a whole range of more sustainable materials and products. And of course, keeping in mind that what we are proving is that you can actually create low carbon products. And so decarbonization, when you've actually shown not only recycling, but remanufacturing and making that finished product. So that entire value chain is actually proven. And we're doing that in a microfactory setting. So back to that point, economies of purpose, absolutely delivering on new jobs that did not exist before, creating highly valued products and doing it in a short span of time. I think to me that accelerating commercialization can happen when that scientific foundation is there. So all the things that we've talked about, fabulous science, how do we then take it in partnership with the industry, whether you're in a small regional or remote community or in an urban setting, it doesn't matter. That fit for purpose technological solutions for which markets can be created, not just in Australia, but globally. And I think to me, we can show leadership in driving some of these sustainable products, and the export opportunities are there because the world is demanding decarbonized products. So thank you very much, Lee.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you, Veena. And there's, again, so many little things to take out of that. I mean, the shared and aligned values piece is super important. And I love the idea of that sort of finding innovation in the supply chain. And the way you describe it, I almost think about the sort of the butterfly effect of innovation, that one small change and suddenly you create these supply chain innovations and opportunities. And to your example of the gentleman you mentioned, in places that perhaps weren't even thinking about that initially, but that's amazing to see. Thank you for that. Now, my last panelist, Michael Molinari, I want to bring you back actually to a point that I heard Misha make earlier on, and she talked about the valley of death. And I'll rephrase it slightly, but Michael, you work at IP Group Australia, and I feel like the way your work sits, it puts you almost in the middle of that chasm. The leap from research and academic pursuits into sort of commercial development and the creation of these new companies that pop out of that. And I noted in the report that you talked frequently about the need for more investor incentive here in Australia, and so the need for more risk taking and the creation of new industry, I think aligns very much to what Veena was talking about. So maybe you could tell us about yourself and the role of IP Group, and then perhaps specifically talk about what do you think is some of the bigger challenges and changes, we could make to the private investment space to make that chasm easier to cross for our scientists.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks Microsoft and CEDA for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I think it's a fantastic and timely initiative and report that everybody is working on, not just National Science Week, but in terms of where we are as a nation in Australia and what the opportunities are that are ahead of us. So I head up IP Group Australia. IP Group is a globally leading investor in new technologies, and we've been operating for 20 years across the UK, US, and Australia now for the last 5 years. Here in Australia, we've been the most active investor in university spin-out companies, so companies developing new technologies coming from the research that is done on campus. And just as a slight sort of parenthetical aside, we often say in Australia that we're terrible at doing this. We're not. What we do in terms of our science and research is world class. We've made 15 new investments here in Australia over the last 5 years, each of which compares very favourably to everything we see out of our university partners in Oxford and Cambridge and UPenn, Princeton, Yale. So there's definitely room for us to be better, and that is what we should always be striving to do. But we shouldn't sort of beat ourselves up too badly about what we do contribute in this space. So that's, I guess, a little bit about me. Perhaps to segue from that into answering your question about private capital, Lee, there's a quote that I'll butcher slightly from Martin Wolf, who's an economist at the FT, which says that the economies or economic power in the 21st century is going to be determined by the strength of the country's innovation systems, not their geography. And I think that's really important to reflect upon. That is really what is going to, by the end of this century, be driving geopolitical power and geopolitical significance. And so we need to be participating in the contest for ideas and the development of our innovation systems and competing and competitive globally around that. And so that leads me to private capital. So, we can have the world's best research ecosystem and we can have the world's best universities, but in order to translate that into impact, and importantly, sustainable impact, we need to link that into the broader economy, and there's an important role for private capital in getting to that sustainable, highly impactful outcome. And so the way I think about it, linkages are super important. And to indulge me in a bad analogy, where we need to get to and where I see this working well globally is where the relationship between our research institutions and our researchers and private capital or the corporate world is like a chain link fence, and it enables two-way communication. There's transfer of, it's a low chain link fence, so people can jump over and transfer back and forth, as well as passing ideas and capital back and forth between. And I think if I look at the Australian environment, where we were 5 years ago was sort of like Stalag 13. You had a gigantic fence, and not just a big fence that was hard to penetrate, separating our ideas from our capital. We had guard towers on top, which were incentivising or encouraging people to stay 50 metres back. And in that environment, you're not going to get that flow of ideas and that flow of capital that's necessary to get to the right outcome. And I think we've seen that start to break down over the last, say decade. And I think we're definitely on the right trajectory here in Australia. And we need to be thinking about how do we, and I think having Veena and Misha on the panel is super important to think about how do we get our research community closer to the fence and get those incentives right. And we also need to think about what do we do to attract capital and business, small and large, to be closer to the fence on the other side and engaging in more conversations. And so, I think there's a lot of opportunity for private capital. We obviously do. We're deploying capital and we're investing actively in new ideas and forming new companies, from biotech to clean tech to new sort of machine learning and data technologies. But we need more. And there's a range of programs that we might get into in the conversation in Q&A that I think we can learn from either in specific initiatives or small-scale initiatives that we've done in Australia or in individual states, but also programs that have been successful internationally that we might be able to adapt and incorporate into what's happening in Australia, so that we get that continuum and the strong linkages that get us all the way from great idea to company formation, importantly, growing those companies into global champions. So I might pause there. I could talk about this all day, but I think I'd be really interested to get into some of the questions that will no doubt come from Veena's and Misha's comments as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. No, that's great. And I love the the chain link fence analogy, in that it's sort of slightly porous and there is this ability to pass through it. I almost have this ambition that we get from being a fence to a shared table, even where we're actually all sitting down. There isn't a fence in the way, but I get the analogy. Look, Veena, I might turn to you because I think what Michael's describing around this relationship between institutions, I guess academic institutions, and private capital, read industry or other forms of it. You've been through that. I mean, you've lived that, you've done that to a certain degree. What have you learned along the way, and what would you comment on kind of the things we should be doing differently in terms of leading that side from your side of the fence?
Yeah, no, thanks, Lee and Misha and Michael. Absolutely critical points that we're all making here. We want to converge to that point where we have those shared values. And of course, from our perspective, what has worked really well is a deeper understanding of each other's motivation, right? So as much as we can say, yep, fundamental science is important, and to be able to publish papers are important. So, you ask sort of scientific colleagues, yes, that's important, of course. And when industries see that view, then I would also almost argue that from an academic perspective, we need to see how translation and impact can actually be delivered. So I guess it's really kind of recognizing each other's businesses, and if I can call it that, and each other's motivation. It's not to say that we all have to sort of quit our sort of day jobs and often go and do other things. In fact, if anything, I would probably say what I love and I see about our industry partners is that literally every spare moment that they have, they will want to come and spend time with us at the Smart Center at the university, because it just opens up all of those ideas. So I guess to me, part of this is, and vice versa. I mean, I remember many years ago when I was spending a bit of my time during my sabbatical days at a steel plant in the States. I think, again, to me, that was absolutely fabulous experience, because nothing beats having that, production floor experience, engaging and talking that language, where you can now understand each other's, journeys. And I think that's important. So if you can then contribute to the journey of sort of not just telling somebody, well, here's a great piece of research, you might find it useful, but rather the journey is done through partnership, where we're then saying, okay, well, now let's kind of work together and implement this. So literally, I mean, for us, what was exciting is when in the early days of when we first started implementation of green steel, that's exactly how it happened. It was really about, this is how we could be doing that implementation. And as we embark and we, grow further and further in that journey of, how do we completely eliminate the need for coal and coke? Again, it's not about us saying, oh, by the way, here's a resource that we think it would work well. And I'll give you a little hint. It sits in my beautiful cup of coffee. So a lot of waste coffee residue is what we've shown scientifically works well. And you can say all the wonderful things. We've patented it and all of that. Should I just take the approach of saying, here's a paper, here's a patent, off you go and read it? That's not enough. And so I guess from our industry partners' perspective also, there's a degree of comfort in knowing that we're looking at the scientific, the technological, and literally designing what that solution would look like in practice. And I think, to me, that's important, because I know the operations. I know that this is how practically it needs to be delivered. So I guess, to me, regardless of the field in which you work, I would arguably say that both parties have to really respect and understand what drives each other. Yes, there's your heart and your head. We're all human beings. I got into this work of research and innovation because I'm absolutely crazy curious and love doing a whole lot of crazy experiments. But I also have to understand and see it from a business partner's perspective. Where are the market drivers? And when we talk about sustainability and decarbonization, back in the day when I first started talking about injecting rubber tires into steelmaking furnaces as a source of hydrogen, I can tell you this, that very few people kind of even wanted to give it a few more minutes to listen. But my industry partners sat down, listened, engaged with the science, and here we are, looking at commercialization. So I think, to me, that interest in the deep science and the practicality of how to deliver outcomes, but also having a vision for the future, so that both businesses benefit from that, and the cutting edge frontier science, I guess, as Misha's calling, has got a way to grow and be impactful.
That's awesome. Thank you, Veena. Oh, sorry, Misha, please jump in.
I add to that beautiful exposition from Veena, Lee, by just, and Veena does this beautifully and powerfully in her leadership. And when I hear that story, I think about this sort of idea of we need more of these connectors of commercialisation. So people who can walk seamlessly between both worlds of the deep scientific and technological understanding of what an innovation or product or capability might be, and really understanding at depth what an industry or business is thinking about, what their frontier challenges are, but also some of the stuff that they may not have thought about. So if I can just share two quick stories to that effect of what I'm talking about there. One of our leaders in our community, Mark Hutchinson, also talks about kind of going and visiting a factory that makes a well-known ice cream product, and so just wandering through the business and saying, oh, what about this? How does this work? What is this? And within sort of the space of 10 minutes had picked multiple things that could make processes less manual, actually enhance all the parts of this deep business that had been running for a long period of time in this really powerful way. So I often say to business and industry members of our community of bringing together those worlds, get a scientist in to look at your business from the ground up. Come and actually invite them in to see what your operation is, because there'll be so many things that they can spot that you may never have thought of. The other powerful example from his centre is they've taken a group of physicists, biologists, all these different mashups of scientific disciplines, and put them together in one centre of excellence funded by the Australian government through the Australian Research Council in nanoscale biophotonics, which is essentially using light to look at what happens inside our cells, and developed a whole lot of things like tiny optical cameras and probes and devices. The applications of that in industry are enormous. So right from the day one in their centre, they brought in people who could teach commercialisation to their scientists and entrepreneurs and technologists, and then they also brought in industry partners and people who could potentially use things. So they have spun off 16 startups and spin-off companies out of this $123 million investment from the Australian government. And they've turned things like probes that are used in brain surgery into a probe that's used to grade meat quality to the most accurate level we've ever had, which of course helps our farmers and exporters command premium prices on the export markets and in the domestic market. They've got optical devices that help sheep graziers to grade wool quality off of a device sitting on a mobile phone. So those sorts of innovations, when people get to know each other, and are profoundly beneficial to really levelling up the economic development that we can achieve here in our country. But we need to actually have more of those connectors of commercialisation, and that's part of the kind of culture shift and the skills shift that we are really, very excited to help work with industry to help deepen its scale.
And I guess, Lee, the point that Misha makes, acknowledging that ARC contribution, the Australian Research Council, having those programs. So again, it's a great platform to collaborate. I mean, we've all given these wonderful examples. I think in all of these cases, and including in ours, the ability to then say, well, if there is a fantastic program like ARC, and I'm sure there are many others where, that collaboration and co-contribution is encouraged. It's not just about that funding piece, but it's also that pathway to impact, right? Because if you've already got your industry partner who is connected into that scientific idea right from get-go, but is also committed towards implementations and trial and testing on site. You've already got people who are starting to communicate with each other. So I think, to me, looking at where programs, like ARC's programming encourages more of that collaboration, I think is a fantastic way. Again, it's not to take away from the blue sky work, which happens, again, ARC discovery programs and so on have that opportunity. But I think equally, the kinds of things that Misha's talking about with ARC centers, whether they are research hubs, they've got training centers, and of course the centers of excellence and so on. So there's lots of opportunities if industry is kind of looking out there going, but, how do I kind of, get started? Mechanisms exist in Australia, and I think that's, again, to be celebrated and acknowledged.
No, it's great. It's a great conversation. And I think, not to to sort of summarize the thing that I take away from this as the least qualified person in the room is I'm hearing this, there's language changes from, we talk about investor relations and it feels like it's one way. And then we hear it talk about partnerships and collaborations and it feels like it's a shared outcome. And I love that. Just language is so important, as we all know, when you're having these discussions. I just want to remind the audience as well, if you haven't already, jump onto Pigeonhole and submit your questions. Michael, I'm going to come to you. We've had a couple of questions come through that I think might land well in your world. We've heard about, we certainly get the sense that there are countries that are doing this well, that are driving great programs of innovation and leaning on their own mechanisms. And at the same time, we're also hearing that perhaps some of that's led through state-led initiatives in those countries or government-fed initiatives. What can we learn from some of our most aligned neighbours in terms of the organisationally how they're set up, from the government and investment side, and what can we take away from that as a country?
Really good questions, Lee. And I'll probably just cherry pick a couple of programs or things that I think that I've seen or that we've experienced that have had real impact. I think if you think about government initiatives, the natural instinct often of government is to put in place a grant scheme, and I think some of that is important, but what's really important in catalysing a major shift, in particularly in the way that gets to sustainability, which comes from attracting private capital into this sector, is ways that government can shift the risk equation for private capital to encourage investment into areas of national focus. And so just if you indulge me in another sort of kind of analogy, we often say in Australia we have a shortage of risk capital. It's not true. Look at the amount of money that is gambled each year on the Melbourne Cup. And if we could take that money that is put at risk on one horse race on one day and redeploy that into supporting innovation and translation of great world-class scientific discoveries into broader economic impact, it really shift the needle, right? So there's no shortage of risk tolerance. It's just where that's allocated in the Australian economy. And I think there is a role there, certainly for well-targeted initiatives to play a role in shifting it. And so one example that we've seen work really well is in the UK, which is the EIS, or the Enterprise Investment Scheme program. And this is a program of tax incentives aimed at encouraging individuals to invest in high growth technology companies. And it's a fairly significant tax advantage, but it has attracted over £1.5 billion a year over the last, I think, 5 years on average to invest in high growth technology companies. And they've recently introduced an additional stream to that, the knowledge intensive or knowledge intensive companies, KIC stream, which is particularly directed towards university spin outs and IP based businesses. And so that's a program that has shifted the needle, has shifted large amounts of capital from one part of investment in the economy and focused it on an area of national focus for the UK government. And I think there's something that we could learn from that. I also think there's, and I'm by no means the only person to be talking about this, but the fact that we have $2.4 trillion in superannuation in this country that is supporting, and we're certainly supported by a number of superannuation funds, which I acknowledge, and that's fantastic. But a broader base of support from the superannuation sector for activity in this space, I think consistent with the sole purpose test, but that can again be catalysed and accelerated by some well-targeted initiatives. And if you really want to shift the needle, $2.4 trillion, not a lot of that has to move in order to again create a huge difference in terms of what's possible for us here.
Awesome, thank you, Michael. I love it. And Misha, there's another question that's come in, which I think actually could be a good follow-on to what we just discussed with Michael. Because we looked at, Michael's given us a sense of what's happening around the world and other examples. Someone's raised the question about your boardroom to bench narrative. And I asked the question of whether you have any good examples of where you've seen that really come to fruition and kind of where do you see maybe government sitting in that equation as well when you think about the boardroom to bench story?
Such a great question. And yes to Mike's point on let's encourage and skill up the literacy of more of our super funds and investor community to really understand what they're looking at in the deep science and tech and engineering. That could be a prospect for investments that deliver really strong returns. I think, this is a really important conversation about how do we get all of the parts of that community joined up in that. So business and the research community working together and the investor community working together on these things. Let me give you a really great example. There's a team at RMIT that's worked on a whole lot of really minute sensors that can be embedded in all sorts of devices, led by Professor Sharath Sriram and Professor Madhu Bhaskaran. Amazing frontier science and engineering and tech work that they're doing. They've worked with an industry partner, Sleep Tight, the manufacturer of mattresses, to develop sensors that go into mattresses that can be placed into aged care and healthcare settings, to enable things like detecting if someone is no longer moving in a healthcare or aged care setting in the bed, or if they need help or if they're in distress, and to really monitor the wellbeing of patients in a health and aged care context. Amazing, transformative stuff, but with a deep relationship that's been forged between a business and the research team, really getting to know and understand each other. And they've used a number of levers along the way to sort of access bits of capital at various points to help that innovation along on its journey. But it's also been about the relationship, getting to know each other deeply and understand each other's skills, capabilities, and a sense of what is possible in those sorts of relationships. So I always say to people, it is worth taking time to forge those relationships. And sometimes in those conversations, an industry partner will say, well, where do I find the front door into the research or science community in our country? There are lots of front doors. We're one of them as the peak body for the nation sector that kind of spans both private industry that employs STEM professionals and the research sector and the tech transfer people in between. So some of our members are those translators, Spigari Consulting and Campus Plus and Cruxus Innovation, doing this important work of connecting those communities. But, there are so many individual scientists working in universities and research institutes as well who are really eager to come and help businesses crack the big thorny problems they face.
Awesome. Thank you, Misha. It's great. I'm learning so much from these examples you're giving. I'm just opened your eyes to just how much is really going on here in Australia. So I want to turn the topic to you, Veena, and something that has come up in the questions, and that surprisingly hasn't come up that much in our conversation, although we've danced around this idea of skills and the skills needed to get there. So I'm going to say the dirty word and say STEM. And I want to kind of get your perspectives, Veena, on, we talk about STEM as being the great savior, the great hope. If we invest in STEM, it's going to fix it all. And I've heard you talk about this idea of decoding STEM. And I'd love to get your viewpoints on where are we at with STEM? Is it as important as we think? And how should we be thinking about STEM in building the future?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I think, as you correctly asked, Lee, if I can sort of, reflect for a moment on, we're basically saying, okay, we've got all this fabulous tech. And if you look at the kinds of examples, the large sort of steelmaking partners versus the SME that I was talking about earlier, in both of those cases, they've actually employed students who are working with us who have come through that journey. Now, for these students, this was, it started out as very much, I'm an undergrad looking for, a project for my final year, or I'm looking for an internship, or, a master's project. It doesn't matter at what level that project sits. But I think the reason why I wanted to bring that point up is that quite often we sort of think that, well, at what level should, students engage in this kind of broader world of STEM and really understand the bigger world around them. Yes, you could be doing a project in a certain area, but it's more than just that. It's not just about you've gone to the lab and you've done an experiment, so you learned a bunch of skills or methodologies. That's a given. Of course, that's what your project and the education will teach you. I think more importantly than that, it's about the fact that when students are given that opportunity to see themselves within that framework of what that industrial world looks like and what that application world looks like, I think it's going to be a win-win outcome. Because with those examples, those large and small corporates, the fact that they've now employed our students over the last decade or so, again, that features across that entire spectrum. Some who wanted to kind of take on jobs straight after finishing their undergrads, some who wanted to get a little bit more hands-on practical experience along with their postgraduate qualifications. So I think to me, that's also something to bear in mind, that, we shouldn't just assume that master's and PhD and all of this is really just about going into the lab and just setting yourself up for an academic career path. I think if anything, you can do a postgrad degree, but if you can also couple that and bring together that ability to start to see how your skills that you're developing and those new techniques that you might be developing and learning can actually be deployed in an industrial setting. So it's almost like this kind of integration. And I can give you an interesting example there. We talk about starting at the undergrad level. I actually started a program a few years ago called Science 50/50 for girls in high school to be able to go, you know what, when you're in high school and you're kind of deciding whether you want to take STEM on as a potential pathway to education and career, how would you make that decision, right? Because at that age, you don't know enough about all of these pathways. So what I did was I actually took them, to visit different sites and locations, in and around Sydney. And every time they visited a certain corporation, got them to come back and tell us about what they had learned, but also importantly, the role models that they had seen. What were people doing that inspired them? And it was always a positive outcome, because I think what they got excited about is they didn't just see the importance of doing that chemistry or that engineering qualification, but they could actually see how that had a big impact on the actual work that a person was doing. And they could literally see and go, well, I actually want to be in the shoes of that particular person because I love that excitement of that job that they were doing. So I think to me, what we're really talking about here in terms of inspiring people to see STEM, not just in the context of here are the scientific and engineering disciplines you need to know, but equally importantly, to see what potential pathways are. Now, they may have their own ideas. In fact, if anything, one of the things I also challenged them when these girls came back from these site visits was, how would you do things better? How would you do things differently? And I can tell you, young people are not shy, as we all know. They had a whole range of ideas. And I think on the last day, we actually invited sometimes family members to come in and sit in and listen. And I think the family was so impressed that they had no idea and that they had learned a lot themselves. But I think the reason why I'm making that point is when we talk about the ability to inspire each other, I always say, inspire others with your stories. And whether you're a kid in year 10 who's had an exciting day, doing site visits, or whether you're a postgraduate student who's gone off, taken the time, spent time in industry, I think there's a lot to be said, which means, we do expect that our industry partners are going to open up their doors, create these opportunities so that experience is offered as an opportunity to those young people who are interested in science and technology and engineering and maths and all the things that STEM is all about. But I think most importantly, what young people want to see is how can they make our world a better place for the future, because they want to shape the future. We need to be able to show those pathways and inspire them and tell them that, the world is yours to shape. And I think we'll deliver a better planet for everyone. And I can tell you there are lots of young people, wanting to put their hands up.
Awesome. That's great. And Misha, I saw you nodding along vigorously there. Did you want to add some comments?
Absolutely. Just powerfully explained. We have a huge need for even more people with those deep skills in science, technology, engineering and maths. And if you think about it, a STEM qualification and education is really the ultimate problem solver's skill set, isn't it? Because you're looking at how the world works, you're thinking about it, you're looking at it from different angles, you're thinking about how can we make it better, how can we fix this problem that someone's got. It is the ultimate sort of skill set in problem solving. And those sorts of skills are incredibly useful and incredibly transferable in a whole range of fields. we know we've got some alarming pictures coming out of the data from our kind of international benchmarked results as a country, with the number of children at the sort of primary and high school levels in Australia choosing to stay in science, tech, engineering and maths related subjects into the latter years of high school. So we've got to fix that challenge in our schools, and we've got to have more people with these qualifications who are going into our teaching workforce and contributing their skills. And we've got to keep reaching actively into the full diversity of our talent pool as a country. So one of the things that we do as a long-standing champion of diversity, equity and inclusion in the science and tech community is to be constantly using our platforms to say to everyone, we need to reach into that full talent pool, whether that's women and the gender equity kind of considerations around trying to build a more diverse and more equitable workforce, whether it's cultural diversity in all its forms is really important. We know that's important not just for equity, but importantly for excellence. More diverse design teams create better innovation, and that's what the long form research shows time and again. So that diversity piece and growing the overall skilled workforce in our country with these deep skills is going to be really important for us seizing this opportunity for our country too, Lee.
Awesome. Thank you, Misha. And I hate to change the topic, Tone, but we've got lots of good questions coming in. And Michael, I want to turn to you because one of the questions that's come through is really around this issue of what defines a successful startup? And I know that's a hard question to answer in our dying few minutes, but just love to get your view on the secret sauce for a startup.
Really, really good question, Lee. And One comment that I would make is a lot of what you see in here around startups can verge on sort of innovation theatre or startup theatre. And so there's a lot of activity that, we've got X number of startups and we formed X number of new companies and, even companies raising X number of dollars. And that tends to be what gets reported and highlighted because it's kind of easy to highlight. It's sort of the number that's in front of you. Actually, what it's all about is economic outcomes at the end of the day and impact. And I always come back to this phrase around impact on people's lives, impact on the economy and impact, hopefully positive. And so certainly we always aim for it to be positive, but impact for the world. And so, that to me is what we really should be looking at and what we should be designing any policy measures we're taking around is how do we get companies that are sustainable. How do we make technologies get to a point where they're in that virtuous circle of creating impact and then that leading to more positive impact, jobs, growth, tax income. So that's perhaps one comment. There was sort of a second part of the question, I think, around what constitutes a successful startup, or if I can rephrase that slightly, how do you know if something's likely to be successful at the outset and what are the elements of that are necessary to be successful? It's people, it's ideas, and it's capital. So we need experienced people in management teams. We need experienced people on the other side of the fence in the research ecosystem. We need great ideas that are truly world-class, that come from the type of interactions that Misha and Veena have described, where we have our researchers going out into the real world and designing their basic research programs to solve problems that the real world care about. So not just doing industry problems, basic research is fundamentally essential, but solving problems that people care about and linking through to capital that can support the people and the ideas to de-risk and get through the valley of death to create that impact at the other end.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate that. And it's a hard question to answer in a short space because, I'm sure you could unpack that in another hour's conversation. Look, we're actually at time, and I apologise to those of you who put questions in and we didn't get to them. Unfortunately, we only have so much time to talk about it. But for me, if I could just phrase a couple of takeaways, it's often when we have these conversations about the opportunity of innovation, it isn't about getting mired in the mechanisms and the things and the processes we can do. It's sharing stories like all three of you did that just give you that spark of moment to think, well, that's possible. And I can see a way forward. And, I often hear this phrase about, you can't be what you can't see. And when we talk about these things and we explain how it's possible to get from A to B, or how to leap that chasm, or any other adjective you want to use in that way, I think it really does open the opportunity up. So for me, thank you all three of you, because you've made my weekend reading list get a little bit longer. I've learned a little bit more, and it's been absolute pleasure to hear from you also. Thank you for your time today. And Joe, I think I'll be handing back to you now to wrap things up. No, we're all done. So we appreciate you all for your time today. It's been a wonderful podcast, webinar session, however you want to call it. Thank you all and enjoy your weekend.